The early evening sun cast its golden light on the winding streets of an affluent suburb. The air was crisp, and the hum of a sleek, metallic blue sports car broke the tranquil silence. Elijah Carter, the 33-year-old tech mogul, adjusted his sunglasses and smiled. His company's latest product had just surpassed 1 billion downloads, marking another milestone in his meteoric rise from humble beginnings. Today was a good day, or so he thought. Elijah's car, a limited edition supercar, was the epitome of success, a symbol of years of grit and ingenuity. As he glided past manicured lawns and ornate fountains, he noticed subtle, lingering gazes from pedestrians. He was used to it. The double takes, the whispered assumptions, they came with the territory of being a black man in spaces not designed for him. Just a short drive to clear my head, he murmured to himself, easing the car into a slower lane. But as he approached the intersection, the wail of a police siren shattered his serenity. In his rearview mirror, Elijah saw the flashing red and blue lights of a police cruiser. He sighed, pulling over to the side of the road. A mixture of irritation and unease bubbled within him, but he stayed composed. This wasn't his first encounter with overzealous law enforcement. The officer approached with a deliberate, almost theatrical stride. His hand rested on his holstered weapon, and his gaze was steely. Officer Daniel Mercer, his badge gleaming under the sunlight, leaned toward Elijah's open window. "License and registration," Mercer demanded curtly, his tone carrying a weight of suspicion. Elijah complied, retrieving his documents from the glove compartment. His movements were slow, deliberate, and calm, a survival tactic ingrained in him since he was a teenager. He handed the papers to Mercer with a polite smile. "Is there a problem, officer?" Elijah asked, keeping his tone neutral. Mercer's lips curled into a smirk as he scanned the documents. "This car doesn't look like it belongs to you." The words stung, but Elijah kept his composure. "I can assure you it does. I own it outright. You'll find my name on the registration." Mercer's eyes narrowed. "Step out of the vehicle." Elijah hesitated for a moment, glancing at the growing crowd of onlookers who had begun to gather nearby. He could feel their stares, hear the murmurs. Keeping his hands visible, he opened the door and stepped out. Mercer circled him like a predator assessing its prey. "You sure you didn't borrow this from someone? Or maybe steal it?" Elijah's jaw tightened. "I don't appreciate the insinuation. Everything is in order. If you'd like to run my plates, feel free." But Mercer wasn't interested in facts. He gestured to his partner, who began patting Elijah down roughly. The indignity of the moment was palpable, each movement stripping away another layer of Elijah's dignity. A woman in the crowd raised her phone. "This is ridiculous," she muttered as she began recording. The growing murmur of disapproval among the witnesses did little to deter Mercer. "Hands behind your back," Mercer ordered. "What? Why?" Elijah's voice rose for the first time. "I've done nothing wrong. You're under arrest for suspected grand theft auto." The cold steel of the handcuffs bit into Elijah's wrists as Mercer tightened them with unnecessary force. The sound of the cuffs clicking shut reverberated in Elijah's mind, drowning out the murmurs of the crowd. His mind raced, a whirlwind of anger and disbelief. Mercer shoved Elijah toward the cruiser. "We'll sort it out at the station," he said with a tone dripping in condescension. The crowd erupted in protests, and the woman recording shouted, "This is racism. He gave you his papers." Elijah, now seated in the back of the police car, stared out of the window. His hands clenched into fists as the reality of the situation set in. He had done everything right. He had followed every rule. Yet here he was, another victim of racial profiling hours later. Inside a dimly lit holding cell, Elijah paced, his frustration mounting with each passing second. When the officer on duty finally allowed him a phone call, he didn't hesitate. He dialed the number of his lawyer, Samantha Brooks, one of the sharpest legal minds in the country. "Sam, it's Elijah," he began, his voice calm but tinged with anger. "Elijah? What's going on?" Samantha's voice was alert, professional. "I've been arrested," he said bluntly. "They're accusing me of stealing my own car." There was a pause, then a sharp intake of breath. "They what? I need you here, now." "I'm on my way," she said, her voice steel hard. "Don't say another word to anyone." As Elijah hung up, he sat back on the cold bench, his mind replaying the events of the day. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the countless others who had faced the same injustice without the means to fight back. "I'm not letting this slide," he muttered to himself, his resolve hardening. Samantha Brooks strode into the police station with the confidence of a lioness defending her pride. Her tailored suit was sharp, her heels clicking against the tiled floor with a sound that demanded attention. The desk sergeant looked up from his paperwork, momentarily stunned by her commanding presence. "I'm here for Elijah Carter," she stated, her voice cool and precise. The sergeant hesitated, glancing at the name on the intake sheet. "He's being processed." "No, he isn't," Samantha interrupted, leaning forward. "Unless you want a lawsuit against this department filed by tomorrow morning, I suggest you take me to him now." The sergeant flinched but complied, leading her to the holding area. When Samantha saw Elijah sitting behind the bars, a mix of fury and determination crossed her face. "Elijah," she said softly, her eyes meeting his. He stood, his shoulders straight despite the humiliation of the moment. "They're accusing me of stealing my own car," Elijah said, his voice calm but laced with frustration. "I know," she replied. "We're going to fix this." With Elijah released on bail after hours of negotiation, Samantha turned her attention to Mercer. She requested access to the arrest report, her sharp eyes scanning the document as Mercer entered the room. "I'd like to know," Samantha began, her tone deceptively polite. "What evidence led you to believe my client, a tech entrepreneur whose name is on the registration, stole his own car?" Mercer smirked, leaning back against the wall. His behavior was suspicious, and people like him don't usually drive cars like that. Samantha's hand tightened around the edge of the report. "People like him?" she repeated, her voice dropping to a dangerous tone. Mercer shrugged. "You can interpret it however you want." Samantha stepped closer, her expression icy. "You've just given me everything I need. Enjoy your badge while you still have it." The next morning, Elijah sat in Samantha's office, a stark contrast to the sterile environment of the police station. The walls were lined with shelves of legal texts, and the faint smell of coffee hung in the air. "They're doubling down," Samantha said, pacing the room. "Officer Mercer has already filed a report claiming you resisted arrest and failed to provide proper documentation." "That's a lie," Elijah said, anger flashing in his eyes. "Of course it is," Samantha replied, "but the burden of proof is on us. And Mercer's got allies. This department has a history of covering for their own." Elijah leaned forward. "Then we take them all down. I'm tired of this. I've worked too hard to let someone like Mercer erase everything because of the color of my skin." Samantha nodded. "We'll need to file a lawsuit for racial profiling and false arrest. But this won't be easy. They'll fight dirty." "I don't care," Elijah said firmly. "I'm not backing down." The case exploded onto social media, with the hashtag Justice for Elijah trending within hours. A video of the arrest, captured by a bystander, showed Mercer's aggressive behavior and Elijah's calm compliance. The footage sparked outrage, with civil rights groups demanding accountability. News outlets picked up the story, framing it as another example of systemic racism within law enforcement. Elijah's face was everywhere, his arrest photo juxtaposed with images of him speaking at tech conferences and charity events. But not all reactions were supportive. Conservative pundits painted Elijah as an entitled elite, accusing him of using race to deflect responsibility. Death threats began flooding his inbox, and protesters gathered outside his company's headquarters. Elijah's assistant, Tasha, rushed into his office one morning, a worried look on her face. "Elijah, there's a news crew downstairs asking for a comment, and security says someone spray-painted 'thief' on the front gate." Elijah sighed but squared his shoulders. "Let them see it. The more they try to silence me, the louder I'll speak." Back at Samantha's office, the legal team worked tirelessly to gather evidence. Jamal, a tech-savvy investigator, dug into Mercer's record and found multiple complaints of misconduct, most involving Black and Latino individuals. "There's a pattern here," Jamal said, laying out files on the conference table. But none of these complaints went anywhere. They were either dismissed or quietly settled. "That ends now," Samantha said, her voice firm. The team also received a breakthrough from an unexpected source. Rachel Cooper, a junior officer in Mercer's precinct, reached out anonymously, offering to testify. "I've seen what Mercer does," she told Samantha in a phone call. "He's a bully, and he thinks he's untouchable." But I can't stay silent anymore. As Elijah's lawsuit moved forward, the department escalated their defense. They released edited body cam footage to the media, portraying Elijah as aggressive and uncooperative. The footage caused a brief stir, with some questioning Elijah's narrative. Samantha countered swiftly, presenting unedited video from a bystander that completely discredited Mercer's claims. The public outcry grew louder, and calls for Mercer's suspension became deafening. But the department wasn't done. Late one night, Elijah received a call from an unknown number. "If you know what's good for you," a voice growled, "drop the case, or you'll regret it." Elijah hung up, his hands trembling, but instead of fear, he felt a surge of defiance. He called Samantha immediately. "They're trying to scare me off," he said, "but I'm not going anywhere." The chapter ends with a press conference held by Elijah and Samantha. Standing before a sea of reporters, Elijah speaks directly to the camera. "This isn't just about me," he said, his voice steady and impassioned. "This is about every person who's been profiled, harassed, and silenced. We deserve better, and we won't stop until we get it." The crowd erupts into applause as Samantha steps forward to announce the next legal move: a class action lawsuit against the department, representing dozens of victims who had been wronged by Mercer and his colleagues. Elijah glances at Samantha, a spark of hope in his eyes. For the first time since the arrest, he feels like he's regaining control. The sound of shuffling papers and clacking keyboards filled the air in Samantha Brooks's office. Her legal team worked tirelessly, fueled by a shared determination to make this case a turning point in the fight against racial injustice. At the center of it all, Elijah sat across the table, reviewing the final draft of the lawsuit. "This document is the first punch," Samantha said, sliding it toward Elijah. "We're suing Officer Mercer, the precinct, and the city for racial profiling, false arrest, and emotional distress. It's ambitious, but it's necessary." Elijah nodded, his resolve firm. "This isn't just about me. If we don't push for systemic change now, it'll happen again, to someone else." Samantha smiled faintly. "It's risky, Elijah. They're going to throw everything they have at us. Then we'll hit harder." The lawsuit was filed, and within hours, the police department responded with a counterclaim, accusing Elijah of defamation and obstruction. Their defense strategy was clear: paint Elijah as the aggressor and undermine his credibility. The department released selective body cam footage to the press, editing out Mercer's inflammatory remarks and focusing on Elijah's initial resistance to stepping out of the car. In a carefully crafted press conference, the police chief defended Mercer's actions, claiming he acted in accordance with department protocol. Elijah watched the broadcast from his living room, anger bubbling beneath the surface. Tasha, his assistant, sat beside him, her expression tense. "They're trying to make you look like the bad guy," she said. "I expected this," Elijah replied, "but they won't get away with it." Samantha called shortly after. "We have our own footage," she said. "The bystanders' video shows the truth. We'll release it strategically, but only when it'll have the most impact." Samantha's team worked around the clock to strengthen their case. Investigator Jamal uncovered a troubling pattern in Mercer's record. Over the past 5 years, Mercer had filed numerous reports of suspicious activity, all involving people of color. Despite multiple complaints, the department had shielded him from accountability. "This guy's a repeat offender," Jamal said during a strategy meeting, "and the department's been covering for him." Samantha nodded. "We need to establish a pattern of misconduct. If we can prove this isn't an isolated incident, the jury will see the bigger picture." Meanwhile, Rachel Cooper, the junior officer who had contacted Samantha anonymously, agreed to meet in person. Nervous but determined, she brought internal documents that showed how complaints against Mercer were routinely buried. "I know I'm risking my career," Rachel said, her voice trembling, "but I can't stay quiet anymore. What he did to Mr. Carter is just the tip of the iceberg." Samantha reassured her, "You're doing the right thing, Rachel. This could change everything." Elijah's arrest had become a national story, with civil rights activists, celebrities, and ordinary citizens rallying behind him. The hashtag Justice for Elijah gained millions of posts, sparking discussions about racial profiling and police reform. But not all attention was positive. Conservative pundits labeled Elijah a troublemaker and accused him of exploiting his race for financial gain. News segments dissected his life, questioning his success and even insinuating criminal ties, a baseless smear tactic. Despite the negativity, Elijah refused to be silenced. He gave a heartfelt interview to a respected journalist, sharing his story of overcoming poverty and systemic racism to build a multi-million-dollar tech empire. "I didn't come this far to be defined by one officer's prejudice," Elijah said during the interview. "This fight is bigger than me. It's about fairness, dignity, and the right to exist without being judged by the color of your skin." The interview went viral, further polarizing public opinion but cementing Elijah's position as a powerful voice for justice months later. The trial finally began. The courtroom buzzed with tension as reporters filled the gallery. On one side, Elijah sat with Samantha and her team, exuding quiet confidence. On the other, Mercer and his legal counsel huddled, their expressions unreadable. The opening argument set the tone for the high-stakes battle ahead. Samantha painted a vivid picture of systemic racism, using Mercer's record as a focal point. "This case isn't just about a single officer," Samantha declared to the jury. "It's about a system that allows prejudice to thrive unchecked." Mr. Carter was targeted not because of his actions, but because of the color of his skin. Mercer's lawyer countered with a defense rooted in procedure, claiming that Mercer acted within the law and had reasonable suspicion to stop Elijah. The first few witnesses included bystanders who had filmed the arrest, each describing Mercer's aggression and Elijah's calm demeanor. Their testimonies added emotional weight to Samantha's case as the trial progressed. Tensions reached a boiling point. A pivotal moment came when Samantha presented an unedited copy of the bystanders' video. Juxtaposed with the department's altered body cam footage, the stark contrast was undeniable, eliciting gasps from the gallery. Mercer took the stand next, his demeanor smug and unrepentant. Under cross-examination, Samantha dismantled his narrative piece by piece, using his own words and prior complaints against him. "You filed over 50 reports of suspicious activity involving Black or Latino individuals," Samantha said, her voice sharp. "And yet, you've never stopped anyone who wasn't a person of color. Can you explain that?" Mercer faltered, his confidence wavering. I just follow where the evidence leads. Or where your biases lead," Samantha shot back, her words slicing through the courtroom as the trial entered its final stages. The momentum seemed to shift in Elijah's favor. Rachel Cooper's testimony was a turning point, exposing the department's complicity in protecting officers like Mercer. Complaints against Officer Mercer were routinely dismissed. Rachel told the court, it didn't matter how serious they were. The department's priority was protecting itself, not the community. Her words resonated deeply, forcing the jury to confront the systemic rot at the heart of the case. The room was heavy with tension as the jury filed out to begin their deliberations. Elijah sat silently beside Samantha, his hands clasped tightly together. Across the courtroom, Mercer's cold gaze never wavered. His confidence hadn't cracked fully yet, but the strain showed in the tightness of his jaw. "Stay calm," Samantha whispered to Elijah. "We've done everything we can. Now, it's in their hands." Elijah nodded, though his stomach churned. For all the strength he exuded, the weight of the case was immense, not just for himself, but for the broader message it carried. Hours into the deliberations, the court was called back to session unexpectedly. The jurors had sent a note requesting clarification about a key piece of evidence. The unedited body cam footage, though presented earlier, seemed to have left some jurors with questions. As the courtroom watched the unedited footage again, a sharp-eyed journalist in the gallery noticed something in the background, a second officer watching Mercer's actions silently. Later that evening, Samantha's investigator, Jamal, dove into the details. "That's Officer Keller," he said, showing Samantha a still frame from the footage. "He was there the whole time. He didn't file a report," Samantha said, her mind racing. "We need him on the stand." The next morning, Samantha made an emergency motion to introduce Keller as a witness. The defense objected vehemently, but the judge, intrigued by the implications, allowed it. Keller was visibly nervous as he took the stand. He glanced briefly at Mercer, whose glare could have melted steel. "Officer Keller," Samantha began, her tone calm but probing. "You were present during the arrest of Elijah Carter, correct?" "Yes," Keller admitted reluctantly. "And yet, You didn't intervene when Officer Mercer escalated the situation. Why? Keller shifted uncomfortably. I didn't think it was my place to question a senior officer. Samantha stepped closer. Did you feel that what Officer Mercer was doing was wrong? After a long pause, Keller nodded. Yes. The courtroom erupted in whispers. And the judge banged his gavel to restore order. The defense scrambled to regain control. Mercer was called back to the stand in a desperate attempt to counter Keller's testimony. His lawyer questioned him carefully, painting him as an officer acting under stress in a high-pressure situation. But Samantha was ready. Her cross-examination was surgical, dismantling Mercer's narrative piece by piece. You testified that Mr. Carter's behavior was suspicious. Samantha said. What, specifically, did he do that made you suspicious? Mercer hesitated. He hesitated to step out of the car. Samantha raised an eyebrow. And that hesitation warranted an arrest for grand theft auto? Mercer's face reddened. It was my judgment call. Your judgment, or your bias? Samantha asked sharply, her voice ringing through the courtroom just as the trial seemed to be winding down. Jamal rushed into the courthouse with a new piece of evidence. He handed Samantha a flash drive, his expression triumphant. What is this? She asked. Internal emails, Jamal said. You won't believe what Mercer wrote about Elijah after the arrest. In court, Samantha introduced the emails as evidence, revealing Mercer's private comments. One email described Elijah as another punk who thought he could outsmart the system. Another referred to Elijah's supporters as loud-mouthed protesters who need to learn their place. The courtroom was silent as the emails were read aloud. Even Mercer's lawyer looked shaken. Both sides delivered their closing arguments. Mercer's lawyer clung to procedural justifications, emphasizing Mercer's years of service and claiming that his actions were reasonable under the circumstances. Samantha, however, delivered a searing rebuttal. She recounted the unedited footage, the pattern of racial profiling in Mercer's record, and the damning emails. This case isn't about one bad officer, she said, her voice steady and impassioned. It's about a system that protects officers like Mercer at the expense of the communities they're supposed to serve. Elijah Carter did nothing wrong, yet he was humiliated, arrested, and vilified because of the color of his skin. Today, you have the power to send a message that justice is not reserved for the privileged. It belongs to everyone. The jury deliberated for what felt like an eternity. Elijah sat in the courtroom, surrounded by Samantha and his family. His mother, a soft-spoken woman with a quiet strength, squeezed his hand tightly. Finally, the jury returned. The foreperson stood, clearing their throat. In the case of Elijah Carter versus Officer Daniel Mercer, we find the defendant guilty of racial profiling, misconduct, and false arrest. The words hung in the air for a moment before the gallery erupted into cheers. Elijah exhaled deeply, the weight of months of tension finally lifting outside the courthouse. A sea of supporters greeted Elijah and Samantha. The press clamored for statements. And Elijah, standing tall, addressed the crowd. This is a victory, he said, his voice carrying over the noise. But it's not the end. It's a step forward. We still have work to do, to ensure that no one else has to endure what I did. Samantha placed a hand on his shoulder. We did it, she said softly. No, Elijah replied, glancing at the diverse crowd of supporters. We all did. The morning after the verdict, Elijah Carter sat at his breakfast table, scrolling through news headlines on his tablet. The victory had made front-page news across the nation, but not all coverage was positive. Pundits on certain networks dismissed the trial as a media circus, accusing Elijah of exploiting his race to win sympathy. Elijah sighed and placed the tablet down. Across from him, his mother, Lorraine, watched him with concern. Don't let them get to you, Elijah, she said softly. They don't know the truth. It's not about me anymore. Mom, he replied. They're attacking everything this case stands for. As if on cue, his phone buzzed with a notification. Another death threat. Elijah's jaw tightened, but he deleted it without a word. Lorraine reached across the table, placing a comforting hand over his at Samantha's office. The team convened to discuss the fallout. Investigator Jamal, holding a thick stack of papers, looked visibly stressed. Mercer's supporters are doubling down, he said. I've tracked multiple smear campaigns online. They're claiming the emails were fake. That Keller was coerced, and that Elijah has a vendetta against law enforcement. Samantha frowned. We anticipated this. They're trying to discredit us because they can't argue with the facts. But they're influencing public opinion, Jamal added. And Mercer's allies in the department are still covering for the higher-ups. If we don't keep pushing, they'll sweep the rest under the rug. Samantha nodded. Then we keep pushing. This case wasn't just about Mercer. We're going after the system that enabled him. Later that night, Elijah found himself alone in his home office, staring at the framed photo of his father on his desk. His father, a hard-working man who had been wrongfully incarcerated decades ago, was the reason Elijah had vowed to succeed against all odds. The memory weighed on him. Despite the trial's success, the scars of systemic racism felt ever present. Elijah grabbed his journal, a habit he had maintained since his college days, and began to write. They say justice was served today, but it doesn't feel that way. The system still stands, battered but intact. I won a battle, but the war feels endless. Closing the journal, Elijah leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. The victory was hollow without lasting change. Days later, Elijah attended a rally organized by civil rights activists. The crowd was electric, a diverse sea of supporters holding signs that read #Justice for All and End Racial Profiling Now. Elijah was greeted with applause as he stepped onto the stage. I stand here today not as a victim, Elijah began, his voice steady, but as a survivor. What happened to me happens every day to people who don't have the resources to fight back. This victory is theirs, as much as it is mine. He paused, scanning the crowd. But it's not enough to win in court. We need change in our laws, our policies, and our culture. And that starts with all of us. The rally ended with a surge of hope. But Elijah knew the road ahead would be long. As he left the stage, an elderly man approached him, gripping his hand tightly. Thank you, the man said, tears in his eyes. I've waited my whole life to see someone stand up to them. Meanwhile, the police department faced mounting pressure. Federal investigators had opened an inquiry into their handling of complaints against Mercer and other officers. Several senior officials resigned in disgrace, but others dug in their heels, resisting calls for reform. Mercer's allies began leaking confidential information to the press, attempting to portray him as a scapegoat. One article even claimed that Mercer had been a dedicated officer, unfairly targeted by a media-hungry tech mogul. Elijah's legal team recognized the strategy for what it was, a coordinated effort to undermine the larger fight. They're trying to flip the narrative, Samantha said during a team meeting. We need to stay ahead of this. Jamal, dig deeper into their internal communications. Tasha, organize another press conference for Elijah. Despite their efforts, Elijah's company began to feel the strain. Investors grew wary of the controversy, and several key clients pulled out of contracts. The financial hit was significant, but Elijah refused to back down. During a tense board meeting, one of the directors voiced their concerns. Elijah, we support your cause, but this lawsuit is costing us millions. Maybe it's time to consider stepping away from the spotlight. Elijah looked around the room, his expression resolute. If standing up for what's right costs us business, so be it. This company was built on principles, and I won't abandon them now. As the fallout intensified, Rachel Cooper, the junior officer who had testified against Mercer, faced her own struggles. Her colleagues ostracized her, and anonymous threats began arriving at her home. During the late-night phone call, Rachel confided in Samantha, I don't know if I can do this anymore. They're making my life hell. Rachel, Samantha said firmly, you're one of the bravest people I've ever met. What you did took courage, and it's making a difference. Don't let them break you. Rachel's voice trembled. I just feel so alone. You're not alone, Samantha reassured her. We're in this together in the wake of these challenges. Elijah and his team redoubled their efforts. They organized community forums, partnered with civil rights organizations, and lobbied for new legislation to address racial profiling. One night, while reviewing proposed policy changes, Elijah received an email from a young man who had seen his interview. Your story gave me the courage to stand up to the discrimination I face every day. Thank you for fighting for all of us. Elijah read the message twice, a sense of purpose reigniting within him. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time since the trial, he felt that victory, real, lasting victory, was possible. The steps of City Hall buzzed with energy as Elijah Carter launched his national campaign. Equal justice now, to combat racial profiling and systemic injustice. The crowd, a mosaic of diversity, cheered as Elijah spoke about the movement's goals: legislative reform, police accountability, and community empowerment. This isn't just a campaign, Elijah said, his voice resonant. This is a movement, a promise that no one will face injustice alone. The crowd roared in approval. But amidst the applause, Elijah couldn't ignore the looming shadows of resistance. He had stirred something powerful, but not everyone wanted to see it succeed. Meanwhile, the remnants of Mercer's support network began plotting their counterattack. In the darkened office of Captain Blake Turner, an old guard of the police department, a group of officers met to discuss their strategy. This isn't just about Mercer, Turner growled. This is about preserving our authority. Carter wants to dismantle everything we've built. One officer, Detective Ray Colton, leaned forward. We've got contacts in the media. If we leak something damaging, we can undermine Carter's credibility. Turner nodded. Do it, and keep digging. There's got to be something in his past we can use against him. A week later, a scandalous article surfaced online, accusing Elijah of unethical practices during his company's early days. The article, riddled with half-truths and anonymous sources, claimed Elijah had exploited workers and manipulated investors. The headlines hit like a sledgehammer. Social media exploded with debate, and news outlets jumped on the story. Elijah slammed the newspaper onto Samantha's desk. This is a lie. They're trying to destroy me. I know, Samantha said calmly, scanning the article, and we'll prove it's false. But this is just the beginning. They're desperate, and they'll stop at nothing. Late one night, as Elijah returned home from a campaign event, he noticed a black SUV idling near his driveway. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end as he parked his car and approached the front door. Before he could enter, the SUV's window rolled down, revealing a shadowed figure. You're making enemies, Carter, the man said in a low voice. Back off, or you'll regret it. Elijah stood his ground, his heart pounding. I'm not afraid of you. The SUV sped off, leaving Elijah shaken but more determined than ever. He immediately called Samantha. They're trying to intimidate me, he said, but it won't work. As Elijah's team regrouped to handle the escalating attacks, an internal rift began to form. Tensions mounted between Rachel Cooper and Jamal, the investigator, as they disagreed on how to handle the smear campaign. During a heated discussion, Rachel slammed a folder onto the table. We need to go public with the corruption we've uncovered. Sitting on it isn't helping. Jamal shook his head. We can't, not yet. If we move too soon, we risk blowing our case. The argument ended abruptly when Samantha intervened. But later that night, Rachel made a fateful decision. She leaked the files to a journalist without informing the team. The next morning, the story broke, exposing damning evidence of systemic corruption in the police department. But it also revealed sensitive details that put Rachel in the crosshairs of retaliation. You went behind our backs? Samantha confronted Rachel in her office. Do you realize what you've done? I couldn't wait any longer, Rachel said, her voice trembling. People need to know the truth. Now, both Rachel and the campaign were in greater danger than ever amid the chaos. Jamal uncovered something startling in Mercer's financial records. Buried among routine expenses were large, unexplained payments to a private security firm with a history of silencing whistleblowers. Samantha's mind raced. This isn't just about Mercer. Someone higher up is pulling the strings. The team delved deeper, uncovering ties between the precinct's leadership and local politicians who had benefited from suppressing misconduct cases. The discovery was explosive, but it also put a larger target on Elijah's movement. As the attacks intensified, Elijah began to feel the strain. His company faced more losses. His personal life was under scrutiny, and the relentless pressure took a toll on his mental health. One evening, Lorraine found him sitting alone in his study, staring blankly at the walls. Elijah, she said gently, sitting beside him, you've been fighting your whole life. Don't let them break you now. I feel like I'm losing everything. Elijah admitted, his voice cracking. What if this isn't worth it? Lorraine took his hand. It is worth it, not just for you, but for everyone who needs you to keep fighting. You've already made a difference. Elijah, don't stop now. Determined to regain control, Elijah and Samantha organized a televised town hall to address the smears and reaffirm their commitment to the movement. The event drew a massive audience, with Elijah speaking candidly about the challenges he faced. "They've tried to silence me, intimidate me, and destroy my reputation," he said, "but I won't stop fighting. Because this is bigger than me. It's about justice, dignity, and the future we deserve." The crowd erupted in applause, and social media lit up with messages of support. For the first time in weeks, Elijah felt the tide beginning to turn. The chapter ends with Elijah receiving an anonymous tip. A key witness who had worked closely with Mercer and the department's leadership was willing to come forward. The tip promised to reveal the true extent of the corruption, but it also came with a warning: trust no one. Elijah stared at the message, his determination renewed. The fight wasn't over, and the next chapter would take him deeper into the heart of the corruption that had fueled his arrest. The anonymous tip led Elijah and Samantha to a secluded diner on the outskirts of the city. There, they met Thomas Green, a former precinct administrator who had worked closely with Captain Turner and other top officials. Thomas's appearance was disheveled, and he glanced nervously over his shoulder as he slid into the booth. "You've got to understand," Thomas said, his voice a whisper. "I've been part of the cover-up machine for years. They'll come for me if they find out I'm talking to you." "Why now?" Samantha asked. "Why come forward?" Thomas hesitated, his hands trembling. "Because what they've done, it's gone too far." Mercer wasn't acting alone. The precinct's leadership, politicians, even private security firms, they all profit from this system. "Your arrest, Mr. Carter, was just one piece of their larger game." He handed them a flash drive. "This has everything: emails, financial records, internal memos. It's all there." Samantha accepted it carefully, her expression determined. "This is the break we needed." As Thomas left, he muttered, "Be careful, you're playing with fire." Back at Samantha's office, the team pored over the contents of the flash drive. The evidence was staggering: bribes, falsified reports, and connections to local politicians who used the police to target minority communities for political and financial gain. "This isn't just about Mercer," Jamal said, his voice grim. "This is a criminal enterprise." Samantha nodded. "And we're taking it down." The next day, Samantha filed a motion to include the new evidence in the ongoing investigation. The revelations sent shockwaves through the city, sparking protests and calls for a federal takeover of the police department as the evidence made headlines. Elijah found himself under siege. Threats against him and his family escalated. And one night, a brick was thrown through his window. Lorraine screamed as glass shattered, and Elijah rushed to her side. "This has to stop," Lorraine said, her voice trembling. "It will," Elijah replied, his resolve hardening. "I'll make sure of it." He installed additional security at his home and relocated his mother to a safer location. But the incident only fueled his determination to see the fight through. The new evidence shifted the balance of the case dramatically. Samantha called Thomas Green to the stand, where he detailed the inner workings of the precinct's corruption. The orders came from the top. Thomas testified. Captain Turner and his allies used officers like Mercer to enforce their agenda. Anyone who got in their way was silenced. The defense attempted to discredit Thomas, but Samantha countered with the digital evidence he had provided. Emails from Turner to Mercer revealed explicit instructions to target individuals like Elijah. The courtroom was silent as Samantha read aloud. "We need another example to keep the community in line. Find someone high profile and make it stick." Gasps rippled through the gallery, and the jury's expressions hardened under the mounting pressure. Mercer's composure finally cracked. During cross-examination, Samantha's relentless questioning pushed him to the brink. "You falsified evidence, didn't you?" Samantha pressed. Mercer squirmed in his seat. I followed orders." "Orders from Captain Turner?" Samantha asked, her voice cutting. Mercer hesitated, then nodded. "Yes." The courtroom erupted, and the judge had to call for order. Mercer's admission confirmed the systemic corruption Elijah had been fighting to expose after weeks of testimony. The case reached its conclusion. Elijah sat with Samantha as the jury returned to deliver their verdict. In the case of Elijah Carter versus Officer Daniel Mercer and the precinct, "We find the defendants guilty on all counts." Relief washed over Elijah as the courtroom erupted in cheers. Justice had been served, but the victory felt bittersweet. The fight against the system was far from over. The verdict set off a chain reaction. Federal authorities launched a full-scale investigation into the precinct, resulting in multiple arrests, including Captain Turner, the city's mayor, implicated in the corruption, resigned in disgrace. Mercer was sentenced to prison, and the department was placed under federal oversight. The reforms Elijah had fought for were finally beginning to take shape. Months later, Elijah stood at the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the Equal Justice Now Center, a nonprofit dedicated to combating racial profiling and supporting victims of injustice. The crowd cheered as Elijah spoke. "This isn't the end of the fight," he said, his voice strong. "But today, we take another step toward a future where justice is truly equal for all." As the crowd erupted into applause, Elijah glanced at Samantha, Jamal, Rachel, and his mother, who stood proudly by his side. Together, they had turned tragedy into triumph, and their story had become a beacon of hope for countless others. Elijah walks through the bustling center. Watching volunteers and activists at work, he smiles, knowing that his fight had made a lasting impact, and that his journey was far from over.